Hello, Professor Pistone here, and today we're going to talk about well-founded fear, the well-founded fear element of the asylum and refugee definition. So there are two ways to establish a well-founded fear. The first way is to establish past persecution. Past persecution creates a rebuttable presumption that there will be persecution in the future. So if someone has suffered past persecution, they enjoy this rebuttable presumption. But the presumption can be rebutted, and it can be rebutted by the government in one of two ways. First, the government could establish that it's reasonable to request that the applicant relocate to another part of the country. And the second way for the government to rebut the presumption would be to establish changed circumstances. So in order to prepare yourself for these potential arguments, you should think about the types of responses you would have to them. In the first case, with respect to relocation, you could argue that no, it's not reasonable to expect the client to relocate to that country, to another part of the country. Maybe she doesn't speak the language, or she doesn't understand the culture, or she doesn't have any family ties. The second would be to say, no, the country conditions have not changed substantially. That maybe if there have been changes, they're only short-lived and not permanent, or other things about the changes that would suggest that that it's not a permanent solution, doesn't create a permanent solution for your client. Now, the second way to establish a well-founded fear is to establish that there's a possibility of persecution in the future. And there you'd want to establish both that the client is subjectively fearful and that her fear is objectively reasonable. And you can establish that it's objectively reasonable through country conditions, expert testimony, other things that show that objectively there's sufficient evidence to establish that it would not be safe for the client to return to the home country. Now, one thing to think about is what level of certainty do we need in order to establish a well-founded fear of future persecution? So the Supreme Court has spoken about this, and the Supreme Court has said that less than a 50% chance of it happening would be sufficient to establish well-founded fear. They've also said that 10%, establishing a 10% likelihood of persecution would be sufficient. So that's well-founded fear. And that's one of several elements of the asylum and refugee definition. Tune into Legal Ed for other lessons on the other elements of the claim. Okay, see you next time. Cheers.